I really like that idea of that all your projects involve passion, I suppose, and real interest in that, and kind of excitement about it, which is really nice.
Yeah.
And so, any work that you're kind of working on more recently then?
So I've had a week of churning through kind of papers with students. I mean, one of the things I really love doing, and is a big part of my job, is supervising student research. I love it when, I mean, whatever they do, it's great. It's great to help people kind of develop their skills as a researcher, but when their interests coincide with mine, that's really great. Or when their interests coincide with things I want to know more about, that's really brilliant. So on my agenda for tomorrow is working on a paper with a student who is a music therapist. So we have an MA in music therapy. I didn't know anything about music therapy. Now I know quite a bit about music therapy, which is really interesting, having supervised students on that project, on that program for various years. And she did a brilliant project looking at how music therapists make sense of race and class in music therapy, how important it is, how it plays out, how it impacts on things. So when my interests kind of coincide with theirs, or where they're doing something that enables me to learn, I really enjoy. So to write that paper, I was reading lots about critical race theory, which I didn't know much about. Obviously knew it's kind of demonized in the headlines and kind of a footballing culture wars and so on. And that was kind of really fascinating, and I really enjoyed that. But the main sort of projects that I have kind of burbling away at the moment are the story completion project, looking at kind of disability and sex and relationships. So that's with Ginny Brown, and we're kind of done some analytic work, and we're going to write up a couple of kind of papers from that. And as you might expect, that disability isn't viewed wholly positively within the context of kind of relationships and sex, and there are lots of kind of quite stereotypical kind of narratives and so on, and that's really interesting, and that is fueled by both of our experiences of becoming disabled by virtue of having chronic illnesses.
Right.
So Ginny has post-Lyme, I always get it the wrong way around, post-treatment Lyme fatigue syndrome. I think that's the right way around. So that's where you get Lyme disease, you don't have treatment early enough, and you just basically have it forever.
Right.
And I developed chronic fatigue syndrome in 2006. And then my experience of disability kind of changed radically in 2017, when I didn't know it at the time, I developed MS. And I kind of didn't win the MS lottery, because before I was even diagnosed, I went to a progressive form of MS and experienced a really rapid onset of physical disability.
Right.
And so for me and Ginny, we thought, well, maybe we should bring our worlds together, our personal experience of disability and our interest in kind of critical sexuality research. And there is some work around disability and sexuality. Most of it's kind of mainstream psychology and doing kind of, you know, how do you feel about dating someone who's disabled? So we thought, well, let's do kind of story completion work on this and see what the kind of stories that people tell. So that's, I think, is a really interesting journey, because for lots of qualitative researchers, and feminist researchers, your kind of personal kind of interweaves into your research, but our personal kind of shifted. And so we had to kind of pivot our research to kind of bring our kind of personal into it. And then I decided that I wanted to do something around clothing, because I noticed that how I dress had changed, because I use what I always pronounce it incorrectly, a rollator. So it's a wheelie walking frame. So it's a walking frame with wheels when I'm outside, or a wheelchair or a mobility scooter. You need all kinds of kit. One thing doesn't work for everything.
Yeah.
And I noticed alongside that, I'd changed the way I dressed. That my dress was a lot louder and more colourful. And I almost felt like I was dressing to the mobility aids in a way that I didn't. If I was really loud and colourful, then people might see me. They might not just see the wheelchair. They might kind of not just see the rollator.
Yeah.
And being the researcher, I had a oh, I wonder if anyone's done any research on this moment. And I looked, and there's very, very little research, but there was a fascinating sociological study conducted in the US, I think in the early 90s. And they found that most people with physical disabilities wanted to kind of melt into the background as much as possible. But then they had this little discussion towards the end of the paper about this kind of unusual subset of people that wanted to be really loud in their dress, that, you know, they were going to be stared at, so they were going to take advantage of the staring by putting on this performance and being really loud. And I thought, oh, okay, that's me then. That's what I'm doing. So I've got a group of undergrads this year doing their projects on kind of disability and clothing, and I've kind of designed a group project, so I'll be able to bring all the data together and kind of write it up for publication with the students as kind of co-authors. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment, kind of in this new territory of disability studies, which is not entirely familiar, but trying, kind of dipping my toe in by taking it into places that are familiar. So previously done quite a bit of work on kind of clothing and identity and sexuality. And then for the story completion study, you know, previously done lots of work on gender and sexuality, but not in relation to kind of disability. So we're not pushing ourselves completely out of our comfort zone. So again, those are little passion projects. No one's going to want to fund research in those areas, but they nonetheless feel important. And it feels important to do something that kind of brings your worlds together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to point out that it's those kind of personal things making you interested in certain topics, which I think is really interesting. And I'm just wondering, in terms of, you know, those little passion projects, as you say, do you find that difficult, that those that kind of way of working, I suppose, for you within academia, is that something that you've struggled with in any way?
I don't think so. My main frustration is that methodological scholarship isn't valued in the way that I think it should be, because it is so essential to everything we do as researchers, but it's not returnable.
Yeah.
It's not something where there's a huge amount of funding. There's kind of funding in sociology in relation to kind of various kind of bodies and so on. So yeah, that's my kind of main frustration, but also a broader frustration of what research we value, what research we see as important. And I think we're not trained as academics about how to communicate and share our research with the people that help us do our research.
Yeah.
We're not trained about how to communicate our research to kind of a public audience, and I think that's a shame, because I think there's so much great research that gets done every day in academia that most people will never know about. And it is partly about platforms, it's partly about open access publishing, but it's also about academics being trained how to communicate their research with people and how to share the wonderful kind of insights and understandings that they develop through their research. And I think that's always been a frustration with kind of critical feminist research and critical sexuality research, is this research is great, but no one knows about it, that it isn't. And how do you communicate this to people, and how can this have a real impact on the world? And I think some of that's been solved for qualitative research through things like kind of meta synthesis and kind of systematic reviews, where qualitative research can kind of influence health policy. But I do think that's a bigger question for feminist psychologists, queer psychologists, critical psychologists, is how can we share the work we do with the world? Because that to me is something that hasn't shifted much in the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real shame, because we do really exciting things, and
yeah,
it's such a shame that all this research kind of goes unread.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.